Greetings and welcome to this tutorial on selectors in UiPath Studio. As we've been doing all along, simply go into our new project via a process from the UiPath Studio home screen. And let's call this project Selectors. And as we've been doing before, save all your projects in whichever folder we've been saving our previous projects to, so you have them all grouped together. And in the description field, I'm just going to simply say playing around with selectors. More importantly, and we're going to find out the eyes in quotes here, the eyes in which UiPath can see the screen, or you could say the UI, the user interface. It's really what we're talking about when we're dealing with selectors. It's the ability for UiPath as the application or the robot, and having its ability to see all the buttons and objects and interfaces that us as humans are able to interact with. It's the mechanism in which UiPath is able to make those same connections and associations. And we'll run through a couple examples here momentarily. Once you have your project identified, your path set, brief description, simply hit create. Bring us to our blank canvas. We'll actually run through a little mini exercise, a little mini project per se, as trying to demonstrate some of the capabilities as it pertains to working with selectors. First things first, to our blank canvas, simply go ahead and open up the main workflow. And the first thing I want to bring in to our project, just to get us started here, is a click activity. So if you look for click, you'll notice there is a element mouse click activity here. And just to demonstrate this very simplistically to start, and I'm gonna delete this activity and demonstrate a bit more of a sophisticated project. But just to get things started, so we can kind of see how selectors work inside UiPath, I want to play around with Windows Calculator first. So I've got Windows Calculator up and running on my machine right now. You see I just pulled it to the foreground. We're going to play around with the selector and simply have it hit one of the number buttons, so you kind of get a visual understanding of what's going on behind the scenes from a selector point of view. So with Calculator running, I'm going to jump back to Studio, and I want to hit this little button here that says Indicate on Screen. And when I do this, you'll notice UiPath will go into a kind of a run mode, if you will, being able to see exactly what UiPath can see. So us as humans, again, we can see all the various buttons that we're able to potentially interface with. What you're seeing at this very moment in time is what UiPath can see, all the various selectors that UiPath can see. What can it actually interface with? So obviously being able to click the button number 5, for an example, and we take that for granted that we can do that, but in this case, with the little gray box with the little orange border around it, this is telling us that UiPath can see in this case, a button that's something that it can click on. So if you actually click here, when it bounces back over to Studio, you'll see it puts a little screen image in here, so you can see specifically what UiPath is trying to interface with. What we need to get into understanding is hitting the little button here, going into the Edit Selector. This is the behind the scenes in which UiPath is able to see that button number 5. It's really just kind of a marked up script right here. It's really, it looks cryptic, but it's really not as bad as it's made out to be. You'll notice if you break the selector into its pieces, this top part here, the very first line is usually talking about the highest level of which the selector is being looked at. In this case, you notice it's talking about, in this case, it's an application, specifically the Windows Calculator application. And then the deeper we get into the selector, so working our way down, you're getting more and more specific into what that particular, in this case, button is a part of. So you'll notice kind of this generic landmark target. Then you notice down here, it's talking about the number pad. So if you look at calculator, it's grouping these buttons into their like pieces here. So, particularly the number pad here, all the numbers, and kind of even more specific, it's a named container here, for the number pad. Then you get down to the very last line. Now you're really getting very specific. And what are we talking about? Recall we clicked on the button in the button number 5 here. Depending on what application you're in, you'll see that the selector will vary accordingly, especially if you get into web pages, which we're going to get into as part of our project here. You'll actually start seeing the HTML code. So if you're familiar with how web pages are actually designed and engineered, the HTML code is really the behind the scenes code that allows a web browser to actually render the page. It's really the directions behind the scenes that tell the web browser how to properly display a web page. But from a UiPath point of view, you don't have to be an HTML expert, but it's using that source code behind the scenes to understand all the activities that it can potentially interface with and interact with. So we'll get into looking at those specific details. So from here, if I simply play my automation right now, the little play button here, debug it, you'll notice it'll pull up calculator and it'll actually click the button number 5. So there you go, there's the 5 being clicked. I did not do that. That was done purely by UiPath, but the magic of that button 5 click again was done because of the selector here at this point. We'll get into some of the other details, this validate button, highlight button, as we get into our project. And obviously over on the right side, you'll notice there's several properties. I want to get into a couple of properties underneath target as well. So again, this was just a little demonstration using calculator so you can see, in this case, it's a Windows application. It's a Windows program, as we talked about here. We're going to switch gears here just a little bit. I wanted to at least get a first little brief introduction into selectors from this point of view. So at this point in time, I want to go ahead and simply delete this little activity here, get us back to our clean canvas. And I want to close my calculator because we are actually going to use the Acme One web page as part of this demonstration today. So I believe this is the first time as part of our tutorials we've accessed the Acme One web page. So hopefully everybody's got an account created. If not, you can go through a registration process here to get an account established. So once you have that account established, simply use your email address that you use to register your account. And in this case, UiPath@gmail.com. And my password, if I can type it in correctly, will get us to the Acme One webpage. So this would be your main sign-in screen right here. Really the home page to the Acme One site. So as we dig deeper into our activities, start getting into some of our project work later on in the course, we will be using this site extensively. First things first, if this is the very first time you've ever accessed the Acme One site, we'll need to actually generate some data. And in order to do that, go into the user options here and click on the reset test data. And then simply hit the reset test data button here. It's going to give us a warning right there telling you your test data has been successfully reset. Again, if you're working on a project, I should have put this up front, you won't want to go through this process, but I'm assuming that everybody that's listening in here is probably potentially logging in for the first time, so I want to make sure we get our test data reset. But again, if you're actively working on a project, I probably should have forewarned you not to do that, because you will screw up your project and have to start your projects over. Go back to home and go into the work items option right here. What you'll see in here is some test data that UiPath, this website, by the way, is owned and curated by UiPath. So this is some of their test data, one of their test environments that we can develop some automations against and do some testing with. but we're going to use it today as part of our selector process. More specifically, notice we have these page buttons down here on the bottom. So being able to go from page to page across the various tables here, getting all the data all the way up to the very last page. What we want to do is have our bot or our automation actually click through each of these buttons, actually clicking the individual page numbers here. Going step by step. So what I'm demonstrating right here manually, this is what we want to teach the bot how to do. Take it all the way up to the end and then terminate and stop. Some of you are probably already going, why don't you just hit the little next page button out here? That obviously will work, but from the demonstration that I'm trying to do today, I want to demonstrate the idea of being able to actually click on the individual buttons as opposed to our next page button out here. With that said, we will actually leverage this next page button as part of our logic. So from what we learned a few moments ago with working with Calculator, which obviously was a Windows application, the same rules apply when it comes to working with a web page. It's, again, the selectors are simply talking about what can UiPath actually see. So to get things started, let's bring that mouse click activity back in. It's going to take us through the same prompt again. Simply indicate on the screen, where on the screen do we want to click? And recall, I said I want to take us page by page up through the top. So obviously the second page I want to hit is page number 2. And one thing to quickly point out why I'm also here, hopefully your screen looks like mine does in the way of the little selector icon here, sitting nice and cleanly around the entire circle button there for number 2. What I'm trying to get at is sometimes individuals will come here and that little box will be offset. It won't be directly on the number 2. What you need to do if that is the case, and if you're still waiting for the selector, just hold tight for a second. What you'll want to do is come up here and set your zoom level. Make sure your zoom level is set at 100%. If it's at any other level other than 100, you might get a really odd selector, as I was trying to describe a moment ago. So I'm going back to indicate on screen. Your little box, as you hover over number 2, might appear to be offset. So that's where you want to make sure your zoom is set at 100%. If yours currently does not look like what I currently have on the screen right now, change that zoom setting back to 100%. Otherwise, you might get some really odd results as it's trying to click through our various pages. And it's really because it can't see exactly the precise spot in which it needs to click on the individual activity or object on the website, in this case, the button number 2 and future buttons as we traverse down the page. So once you get the selector going here and it's hovering over button number 2, you got that nice clean box wrapped right around number 2, simply click on it. And notice it'll take us back into Studio. And this, again, this is our selector for actually clicking button number 2. If I go in, and you always want to do this, you always want to go into your selector and do an edit selector and just see what UiPath can see. And this right here looks like what I would call a very clean selector. And what I'm getting at there, you'll notice there's not a lot of excess, and the details down here look to be very explicit, very specific in this case. One thing, and it's a tricky concept to try to explain to people, but the notion behind a selector is you want your selector to be generic enough, yet specific enough. So those are obviously polar opposite statements. You want it to be generic yet specific enough that it can hit the exact button or object or text box or whatever the object is on the user interface that you're ultimately desiring to be interacted with. What I mean by generic enough, you want it to be able to work across multiple pages, multiple records or accounts or instances. So you don't want your selector to be so specific that it only works on a single page. It needs to be able to potentially work across multiple pages. As we get into some of our project work later on down the road, that notion of working on a generic page in the way of not working just on a single explicit page. We'll make a bit more context as we get into some of the project work, but it's You want to be able to have the selector work across all possibilities. But now that you're in a specific page, taking it from generic to specific, you want to make sure in this case you're really talking about button number 2 in our particular case here. This A, so notice all of a sudden we're getting into a little bit of HTML code here. What's the name of the web page? And in this case, the tag A is talking about an anchor tag. It's something that's clickable on our web page. In this case, the AA name here talking about button number 2. Looking at our web page here, specifically talking about here. One of the cool little features inside of Studio is you've got this ability, once you have a selector, this validate button is telling you this is a good selector, it's a valid selector. UiPath, recognizes and understands what it is we're trying to do here. If I hit the highlight button, it's actually going to show you what does UiPath see. So notice the little red box shows up around the number 2 here, simply telling us that's the very activity or object on the interface that it's trying to actually work with. Sometimes those selectors don't always work as cleanly as we would like them to. And that's where we've got this ability to go into UI Explorer. And if I pull UI Explorer up here, you simply clicking on the link here, you should get a new window that pops up on the screen. This is going to allow us as the developer to kind of see all the additional attributes and objects that we might be able to bring into our page. And again, it's really talking about from top down again, highest level, what is the web page that we're currently on? Here's your opening of your HTML page, the body of your web page on down. But trying to really narrow down the specific item in which we are trying to interface with. In this case, UiPath was able to bring back the AA name of button number 2 and the tag of A. Notice down here you get into some specific class level type details. So if we needed to get a bit more specific, you could click here and bring in the class. Notice now it's talking about all the page numbers here. If I add that and hit validate, notice it's still good. I can hit the highlight button here. It brings me into 2 here. In this case, obviously I don't need that extra level of detail, so I'm going to omit that. The AA name is actually and notice here it's telling the active accessibility name of the UI element. It's an object in which UiPath identifies and then brings in and usually tries to hone in on being a very specific attribute. So if you see this in your selector, you can typically, but not always, assume that you got a very specific selector defined. Selectors are going to be something that they're trivial, and that's why you heard me mention a moment ago, they're hard to explain and to teach. That it's something that's going to evolve in time and with practice. And really, from my personal experiences, I've seen this being one of the I want to say longer parts of the development process, trying to get these selectors exactly right, exactly perfect. The times that I thought I had everything exact, I run into a new record that I'm trying to process through, and a selector fails on me, and then I got to go back to the drawing board and continuously fine-tune these selectors. So it's a lot of the fine-tuning is done right here inside this UI Explorer window. This is why I pulled this up. But for now, we're going to keep things simple. We'll go with the selector that it was originally designed with here, which appears to be good enough for our purposes today, but I want to definitely put that disclaimer in there. Say that this is going to be something that as you work on your actual individual automations down the road, it's going to take a bit of work. It's going to be challenging. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but understanding how you're able to manipulate these selectors, make them work to your advantage. Understanding how they specifically work with the UI elements. That's the important takeaways out of our lesson here today. So again, along the idea of working with selectors, I'm good with this one. Simply hit OK here. One of the other really important attributes that I always try to ensure that I have set is this wait for ready attribute over here in our properties window as it pertains to this click event. Any of our UI specific controls or activities that we bring in will typically always have this wait for ready attribute. And what this is talking about is really waiting for the web page or the application to be loaded before UiPath attempts to work with whatever that activity or control is. So as I hover over wait for ready, it even kind of walks you through the details here. So if you don't have anything set here, it's telling you that it's not going to wait for the target to be ready. It's going to attempt to immediately start clicking the button number 2, even before, in this case, the number 2, whatever your activity might be, before the web page is, technically even ready or loaded. Interactive, obviously, saying wait until only part of the application is loaded and complete, waiting for the entire application to be loaded. I typically, up to this point, always come in here and tell it to wait for ready to be complete. Don't attempt to start clicking on the button number 2 in this case, or whatever activity you're trying to click on, until the entire document, web page, application, or whatever is successfully loaded. Don't get too greedy here on us. Let's wait for things to load before attempting to click in on the number 2 at this rate. So at this moment in time, we set the wait for ready. We checked out our selector. Things are looking good. Obviously, you can come in here and change your description and be a bit more specific as to exactly what this is doing. We'll table that thought for later. But at this moment in time, just like we have with the calculator, I can now hit the play button, or the run button. I should say run button, the debug button up here. And we actually should see UiPath open up IE here for us, bring it to the foreground. Simply click on the button number 2 and notice it has done that very behavior. We've now officially clicked on button number 2. So the logical approach here, I told you we want to be able to click through the various pages of our website. Should I just simply bring in another click activity? Well, we can indicate one on screen. In this case, we want to go to button number 3, or page number 3. We click, look at our selector again. It looks pretty much like the last one, but we're now looking at page 3 instead of page 2, so that looks good. And I want to set my selector on complete. One thing I want to do real quick here is set my page back to page 1, so I could either click on page 1 or hit the little refresh icon to have it. In this case, if I refresh the page, I think it stays on page 2. Just notice the page 2 up top here. That's actually another way we could potentially play with our page. We're going to find out as we go through UiPath. There's always going to be multiple ways to accomplish a task. And obviously, playing with our page number up here would be one way. In our case, I really want to hone on selectors right here today in this lesson. So again, being able to walk through. But I want to make sure right now I'm on page 1. So if I go back to UiPath and hit play with my new changes here, I got 2 and 3. If I run my automation here, it brings it to the foreground. There's 2 and 3. Now all of a sudden I'm on page 3. But notice, I'm guessing that your guys' information or pages is different from mine. Notice some of you may have 9 pages, 10 pages. I've got 13 right now. I've got a total of 13 pages. So taking this approach that I'm currently on, how will I ever know when to stop? Obviously, if I bring in another click activity, page 4, page 5, page 6, and so on, how do I tell the killer automation to stop when I get down here to the very end? And that's going to be kind of our little mini activity or lesson here today. How do we come up with really what's known as a dynamic selector, the ability to leverage what the web page or the application design is. In this case, you'll notice when I'm on my very last page, go ahead and click on your last page. You'll notice the little next page icon is gone. So kind of doing a play on a couple different things here. This notion of a dynamic selector. Notice when I look at my selector for page 2, I'm actually, I want to copy this and I'm going to put this in the notepad just so we can see these side by side. Notice I can copy my selector. Here's notepad. I can paste my selector in here. I'll show you what I'm trying to demonstrate here. You don't necessarily need to do the notepad thing here if you don't want. I'm doing this mainly for demonstration purposes. But if I copy and paste both selectors in here, do you notice a pattern that's sitting in front of us right now? Notice both selectors are 100% identical with the exception of the page number that we were attempting to click on. And this notion of dynamic selectors is talking about this very thing. So we can actually take advantage of being able to put a variable in place of these actual numbers 2 number 3 and have it actually walk through each of the page numbers and perform that click activity depending on which page number we currently want to click on. So hopefully that's starting to make you think about looping structures. So going back to our looping structures conversation that we had previously. So being able to put this into some type of a loop and be able to change the page number accordingly. So we're clicking on each page, obviously, until we get down till the very last page where that next page icon is no longer found. So in order to do this, I want to close my notepad here, but being able to point out again the idea of, we have same selectors, 2 different click activities, and really the only difference is the 2 or the 3 depending on the page number. And that's what we're going to leverage here as part of our process. So with that said, obviously I'm not going to need 2 click activities, I'm only going to need the 1. So I want to delete the second one, but brought that in purely from demonstration point of view. And as we ran our automation, you notice it went from page 1 to page 2 to page 3. So we know our logic is right. Now we just have to get it all into a single example that we're able to leverage. So first things first, playing around with this dynamic selector concept, we're actually going to need a new variable here. You heard me say for our selector, we need the ability to replace our explicit number here with a variable. So first things first, let's create a new variable. And let's call this one int page number. What page number are we wanting to work with? So I want to make this an integer because we're actually going to have to do some math on it and have it go up a page at a time. So declare this one in the variables tab, int page number as a integer 32. And to make things work a little bit cleaner, well, you know what? Let me hold that thought. I'll come back to there. Int page number. Go into our selector now and take your number 2, delete just the 2, make sure the 2 double quote, or not double quotes, the 2 single quotes, the 2 apostrophes are still there. Do a open curly bracket, type in our variable name, int page number, and then do a closing curly bracket on the other side. But one thing that we didn't talk too much about, notice as we changed our selector here, this little green validate button has now turned yellow or kind of a yellow-orange color up here. It says the selector was modified, please revalidate. If I click this button, it's going to come back in an error. And the reason why is at this moment in time, the short answer is this text on the screen does not appear in our automation. But more importantly, this is actually now a dynamic selector. This is what I was getting ready to show a moment ago, and I hesitated and paused. Notice int page number right now has no value. And then what I'm honing on is this default value box. It's actually kind of a cool little feature that UiPath affords us here. If I go ahead and hit OK and save my selector here for just a moment, if I put in a page number down here, recall we deleted the number 2, so I'm going to put the 2 back in our default here. Look, I clicked off of it too quick there. So int page number, again, is integer 32 with a default of 2. Look what happens when I go back into my selector now. You'll see all of a sudden it's happy, it's validated. What you're seeing right here is the 2 that we set in our default value for int page number is actually getting passed into our AA name up here. Our int page number here is being resolved down to the actual number 2 here. This is what we call dynamic selectors again, using a variable to represent the actual value that would typically or normally be found here. So watch this. If I hit highlight, you'll see that it's looking at number 2 again. So hopefully you're picking up on the idea. If I change the 2 now to a 3, if I go back in my selector, notice it's still valid. If I highlight now, look at what happens. Well, that's not very good. I obviously don't want to see a highlight page 2. I set my, oh, notice I didn't save here my default value to 3. If I click off of 3, there it is. Now, if I highlight, there's my number 3. So in this case, what you just saw there, I didn't get totally off of the 2. I didn't actually save my 3 in there. So with that same idea in mind, let's throw another page out there. In my case, I do have a valid page 10. Make sure as you're changing your numbers, you're actually putting in a valid page number. Notice I got a page 10 out here. So just to demonstrate that this works across all pages, I got my 10 in my box here. So if I edit my selector now and highlight, you'll notice it's now got number 10 at the very end. So we know we're on to something here. This dynamic selector is working. It's substituting in, again, the default value right here for our defined variable for here. So again, now we start thinking looping. How can we walk through page by page and get our selector working? So first thing I want to do is get rid of my default value. Obviously, it's going to make it a bit tricky if I go in and edit my selector, but we know we have a good selector here. It was working, so we should be able to work with this one. As you heard me say, we now need to bring in a looping activity. I want to bring in this case, a do while loop. Recall the difference between do while and while is do while checks our count after our situation after we process some logic, while the while loop checks before. So I want to bring in a while loop. Recall a while loop will continue to execute until a certain condition has been reached. And in this case, this is where, as we go to build our automations, we have to get kind of creative in our approach as to how pages that we're trying to automate work. And what I'm specifically honing in on, and I've already kind of pointed it out, this idea of this next page button. Notice if I'm on any page out here as I'm clicking through, that next page button will always be present up until, notice as I'm kind of clicking towards the end, it's still there until I get to the very last page in my list. You'll notice that next page icon has officially disappeared. So there is another activity that I need to introduce here. And this activity call is called element exists. You'll see it right here. Not the CV element exists, just simply element exists. Notice element find element exists. I want to bring this inside of my do while loop, so inside the body of my do while loop. Notice it's similar to what we saw a moment ago with our click activity. It's saying what element on the screen do you want to be checking or looking for? You notice if I hover over element exists, it's telling you right here, it verifies if the UI element exists. Kind of tricky here, even if it's not visible. If it's hidden, UiPath is actually still able to pick it up. And recall, the reason it's able to pick it up is, remember, it's looking kind of behind the scenes, it's looking at the code. And that just because something's hidden on the screen doesn't mean behind the scenes it's not there in code. So that's why it's saying it can pick it up even if it's invisible to the human user. UiPath is a bit more powerful and it can actually see it. So it's one of those things. It's not going to be a problem for us today, but I call this out if you're playing with this activity. I've run into automations where items have been invisible to the user. UiPath picks them up, and this activity becomes troublesome to potentially be able to use. That's where then you got to figure out another approach or another alternative way of solving for that particular problem. So element exists activity. Make sure on your web page you are not on the last page. Obviously, if you're on the last page, this won't work. So go to any page. It doesn't matter which one. Go to any page, ultimately, to where we can get down to our next page button here. We need to be able to see this. What we're asking UiPath at this point with this element exists activity, go ahead and click on the indicate on screen. We're asking UiPath right now a question. Can you see this next page button on the screen, yes or no? And that's why with this selector here, if you click on it, you're going to have a thing here that says element exists, and particularly looking at the button here. Notice as I hover over here, it's a good reminder. These are just little thumbnail screenshots, and they're obviously not the actual activity. So you'll notice in my selector above with the 2, with that dynamic selector now, I have page 10. It still is interfacing with 10, even though the image is on 2. It's the exact thing that you clicked on or were interfacing with at the time you initiated that particular activity. Again, though, kind of digressing there for a moment, bringing this element exists activity in. Anytime you have a selector-based activity, make sure you always look at your selector, make sure it looks like it's generic again, yet specific enough to meet the specific need that you're trying to get at. In this case, this looks pretty good. It's following that same syntax. AA name for the next page is a clickable button. We're on the work items page. The only way we're ever going to be able to work with this logic is if we're on this very page. So we don't need to do anything too specific or particular here. So hit OK here. Selector looks good. Remember, in this case, I want to set my wait for ready to complete. Make sure the UI is fully loaded before we complete this activity. Notice one additional thing here that was not on our click activity. We've got an output here. Now, if I hover over the exists, it's saying it's going to indicate if the element exists or not. Is it going to return to us a Boolean value? It's a yes, no, true, false. Does this particular activity appear on the screen? Yes or no, true or false. So we need a new variable here, and recall we can do a Control K right here in the box to set a variable. Now I want to have this one simply say bool next page exists. Does the next page button, is it there? Does it exist? Does that next page button, does it exist on the user interface? And that's really my indication. So if this icon is here, when we get down to our condition, does this next page button, is it on the screen? If so, we need to be able to loop again to click on the next page. So bringing in our next page exists, I want to make sure that notice here I clicked on the body, make sure the scope of this, I'm going to set this at the sequence level, at the higher level. The reason I need to do that is I need this very variable to live in our condition here. So make sure that new variable bool next page exists at the sequence level. Same thing if your int page number for some reason is not set at that level, go ahead and set it to the higher level as well, just so we don't lose the scope of those two variables. Bool next page exists. And if I click off that, what this is going to do, it's going to ensure, as long as this icon's on the screen, continue staying in the loop. As soon as we get to, in this case, the very last page, that icon won't be there. It will escape out of the loop, and our application should terminate. So the next little thing that is needed to be done here is we need to bring our click activity inside of the loop. We actually need it to go through. So I'm going to drag this and place it right above the element exists activity. So it's going to click, go to the next page, and then once we're on the new page, check to see if the next page icon is there or not. I want to bring in, obviously, we got to do something with this counter, or our counter, in this case, our page number here. We need to make sure that we are successfully incrementing the page counter. So I want to bring in a assign activity. I want to bring this above my do while loop. So at the very top here, int page number. I want to let everybody in on a little secret. We're going to start with our page counter at 2. And I want to show you the rationale and reason why. We're obviously going to have to do a little bit of work here. When the page first loads, I want to go ahead and make sure we're always on page 1 to start for now. We're going to do a little bit of cleaning up and make this logic work appropriately. But notice if I had the page counter as 1 right here, if I set this to 1, this is what's going to happen. It's going to come into the page. Remember, the counter is at 1. The first step that we're going to take is to come in here and then click on button number 1. We'll call our dynamic selector here. It's going to then click on page 1 and watch what happens with the way UiPath design is. When you click page 1, it takes you back to the home page. It doesn't actually stay on page 1. Obviously, that's a behavior we do not like, and then are going to have to handle here in just a moment. But to get things started, we're always going to assume we're on page 1 to start, so we'll make sure that we are. With it starting with the page 2, it will ensure it immediately comes in and clicks on page 2. And then obviously it'll then go 2, 3, and on down. Anytime it's on the current page, if it clicks itself, so notice it's on page 3, then it takes me back to the home page. It's a goofy, flawed design that they have in their logic. We have to obviously be able to work with it. So in this case, that's why I'm starting my page number on 2. So logic-wise, it's now saying, come in here and click on page 2. It's probably not a bad idea to put a log message in here as well to actually be able to see what UiPath can see. So bring in a log message. What page are we currently processing? So I'm going to put an informational message in. It simply says, click on page, in this case, in quotes, int page number. Notice this is an integer log message expects string, so I have to typecast this to a string. So click on page. What page do we want to click on here? Notice my error here. I failed to successfully concatenate my values. Notice I'm missing a plus right here. Int page number. Click on page plus concatenate int page number to string. Convert that number to a string. What page number are we getting ready to click on? It's going to click on, in this case, 2. So you gotta kind of follow your logic through here. It's going to actually click on page 2. We're checking to see, are we on the last page or not? Actually, we probably should put another log message here to validate what are we seeing here. Informational message. Simply say the next page button exists, question mark. And then in this case, bool, next page exists. Again, this is Boolean. It's expecting string, so we have to convert to string. Does it exist, true or false, yes or no? We need to make sure, either way, we need to make sure we increment our page counter here. So underneath our log message here, set our int page number here to be int page number plus 1. Ensure that we make it to the very next page. Obviously, it'll increment to page, in my case, page 13 was the last one. It'll increment to 14, but the check here, page 14 doesn't exist. It'll escape the loop. So the counter is going to grow beyond the reach of the page, but the good news is it's not going to make its way back around and actually click on the next page button here. We should have our core logic in place here to where our automation should generically run. Obviously, make sure you're on page 1. Now, if I click this again, I'll go to the home page. So we're on page 1 here. Let's go ahead and hit the play button or the debug file here and see if our logic actually works as desired. So notice here it's clicking on page 2. It's checking to see next page. There's 3, there's 4, and on down the line. Hopefully it stops at 13 when it sees that next page icon is not there. And I just realized I've got a bit of an issue that we need to clean up. You're going to see there's going to be a 30-second delay right here before the bot terminates. Notice the next page icon is not there. This 30-second delay that I'm talking about is I failed to set a property on this particular element exists activity. It's waiting 30 seconds by default. That's the default value that's set. It's checking, it's waiting, it's hoping. UiPath is like, that button's got to be there. It's waiting for it to appear. It's got to show up. 30 seconds later, it's not going to be there. It's going to say it's not there. We're not on the last page, which is the logic we desire. We're just making it wait longer than it needs to. So we need to make a little change here so it doesn't sit here for 30 seconds for no unnecessary reason. So 30 seconds, Jeopardy countdown clock is going. We should see the bot end here in just a second. Looks like it did. It's kind of running there in the background. You notice it took 54 seconds. And again, it's because of this. Here's what I was talking about. Element exists activity. Set the wait for ready. It's this here, this timeout. Notice the description here. Specifies the amount of time in milliseconds to wait for this activity to run before the error is thrown. Notice the error, it's not really an error, it's tripping up our output here. Let's change this timeout milliseconds to 5,000, which is the equivalent of 5 seconds. Milliseconds, 5,000 milliseconds is 5 seconds. So now it will only wait 5 seconds at the very end. The good news is you saw the bot successfully navigated its way through the page. Notice our little output here. We started on page 2. It says, is the next page there? When we're on 2, it does. All the way down to the end, it clicks on 13. The next page button is not there, so it tripped to false. And in this case, the execution successfully ended without error. Hopefully everybody was getting similar results. So now if I rerun my automation, make sure I set my page back to page 1 manually. We're going to make a tweak to this here in just a moment. Ensure that this logic works across all instances. Page 1. And if I go back and run my automation, you'll notice there's only going to be a 5-second delay at the very end. So let things get rolling here. There's the 2, 3, 4, and it clicks its way down the page. Recall how as we started this activity, remember we were going to put multiple click activities, and now we've got a single click activity using a dynamic selector. In this case, it's actually working its way down the page. Now we should only have a 5-second delay here at the end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and in the background over here, I notice UiPath is saying that it's done. And you'll notice the runtime is much faster now. It only waited the 5 seconds. So this timeout, this is something that depending on your automation, you'll have to play around with accordingly. Another thing that I want to look at here is how can we tell if we're already on page 1? So obviously we know we've got a element exists activity. This is where we as a developer have to get a bit more creative in our approach here. And what I'm trying to get at is if I look back on the page, notice the current selected page. What do you notice about it? Hopefully you're picking up all the unselected pages are in black and the selected page is in white. So if I go back to this notion of are we on page 1 and not wanting to click on it, notice the page 1 is now white and 13. The current selected page has a different color. We need to know if we're currently on page 1 in this case. So I want to go back to UiPath. I want to bring in another element exists activity here. I want to bring this one in before we actually click on the individual page here. So element exists activity. Let's bring this up above. Now, you know what? Let's bring right here. We'll leave our clicking on page counter here alone. So this indicate element on screen. This time I actually want to click on page number 1. You'll notice my selector though just simply looks like page 1. There's not a lot of detail here. So this is when I kept talking about generic yet specific enough selector. This one is not specific enough. And what I mean by that is it's not telling me anything about it being the current selected page number. I'm curious to see if there's anything that might clue me in on that this is the current selected page. So that's where I need, if I don't have enough detail here, that's always going to be our clue that you need to go into UI Explorer so you can dig into the selector in a bit more detail. And in this case, if I start poking around here, do you guys notice anything in my window over here on the right that might imply anything about being the current selected page? And hopefully right off the bat, you'll immediately get into this class attribute up here and go, oh, wait a minute. This thing's talking about, it's all the page numbers, but this happens to be the current selected page. This is actually some code that's, here, thankfully to us as, the UiPath developer here, this is something that the web developer has put into their code that's identifying this being the current page. So they've got some logic in their web application that's calling this the current page. That's what's allowing them to do some work that's triggering that page color on their side. We're able to piggyback and leverage that in our automation using their code. In this case, this is actually talking about the current selected page. In this case, page 1 is the current selected page. Notice it's not in our selector yet. You actually have to hit the little checkbox here to bring it in to our automation. If I hit validate here, you'll notice it's happy. If I hit the highlight button, everything's still good. It's talking about the current selected page. Watch what happens here, just to give you a bit more of a visual to this. I'm still in the UI Explorer. Jump over to page 2. So now page 1's not the current selected page. Page 2 is. If I go back in here and attempt to validate my selector, you'll notice it's now an error. Page 2 is now the current selected page. Page 1 is not. So this is telling us that page 1 is not the current selected page. So at this rate, we'd want to be able to click on it. Watch this, so we know our selector, we can play with it here a bit. I'm going to change my 1 to a 2. If I validate, look what magically happens. It's now telling me that page 2 is indeed the current selected page. If I go back to UI or back to the web page and change it back to page 1, so you can see I'm just kind of playing with the selector here, and this is what I was talking about. Sometimes you just have to toy around and see if this is really behaving the way you desire. If I validate here, remember I got page 2, I changed it to page 1, change this back to a 1 and validate, and I should be good to go. Page 1 is now the current selected page. Another thing that we have not talked about with our selectors to this point is the notion of being able to make a selector a bit more generic is with the use of a wildcard character. I probably don't need it here, but purely from a demonstration point of view, the only thing that I really care about in this class is the current page. So notice I'm highlighting page number and I'm replacing it with a star or an asterisk here. This is saying I don't care about the first part of the selector name here of the class being page numbers. I only care is the word current in the class, yes or no. That's what the wildcard is doing. It's allowing us to replace text as a selector. I don't care what's in the selector, but current has to be there is what this is trying to tell us. So this is a way that you can make a selector a bit more generic and work a little bit broader as potentially needed. So not necessarily a great use case here, but wanted to at least include that in our demonstration here today. So hit validate here, you'll notice the selector is still happy. It knows that page 1 is the current selected page. So I want to save here, and you'll notice this will bring my selector back into UiPath right here. So there's our page 1, there's our wildcard on current. One example of wildcard though, as I could point out, notice in this case it doesn't make sense to change it. Work item is obviously the only way you would ever get here, but if you needed to make your title of your web page more generic, that's where you could put a wildcard selector on your page number here. If I hit highlight again, page 1 is indeed the current selected page. So I'm cool with this selector. That's where we actually had to make a modification. This is actually now asking the question, is this the current selected page? Again, set your wait for ready to complete. And obviously at this rate, majority of the time, this selector will not be there. The current page is only going to exist one time. So I want to make this timeout very minimal here. I'm going to set mine to 1.5 minutes, so 1.5 seconds before it times out. Because majority of the time, it's not going to be there. So now, once you have, and obviously I'm missing a step here, my output here, I need to say, are we on the first page? So a new variable here, Control K, bool, I'm going to call this on first page. Are we on the first page, yes or no? And hit enter. Are we on the first page? And in a case like this, we need to check what's going on. Are we on the first page, yes or no? That implies we need an if activity. I need to check the value of this output here. So bring in an if activity right underneath element exists and simply say, are we on the first page? And more importantly, I now can change my counter up here to start on page 1. Actually attempt to have it start on the first page. So I want to have it do a check here. If I'm on the first page and I'm attempting to click on the first page, obviously I don't want to do anything. I don't want to click that page 1 button. The only thing I want to do is when that scenario is not the case, so this is where I'm bringing my click activity in that we did a moment ago, putting it on the else side. This is saying if we're on the first page and the current page number is 1, do not click on it. Do not do anything. If it's anything but that, go ahead and continue. So if page number is 2, then go ahead and click on page 2. So at this rate, it should skip over our logic here on page 1 now. One thing we probably should have done as we've gone along, make sure you update these activities. We want to be able to have a little cleaner understanding of what's going on here. I want to say, are we on page 1 as the current selected page? Obviously the if activity here hopefully is a bit relevant. This obviously is going to be our activity of clicking on next page dynamically using int page number. And down here, we're checking, again, are we on the last page? Are we on the last page? Obviously, if we are, that's what's going to cause our loop to terminate our assign statement here. Increment to next page. Able to click next page. Something along those lines. Just a little brief notation as to what it is we're trying to do. So now, again, recall up here, at the very, very top, the assign statement here. We'll say init page number to 1. Just so everybody's aware, we could put the 1 down here in our int page number as a default. That will always ensure that the default value starts with the 1. I always find it a bit easier to put the assign activity here so you can actually see it as part of the sequence. But just to be transparent, the 1 could exist here, or it could be in the default value. Since it's the very first activity in our workflow, we'll always ensure that it comes into the number 1. So just to see if my new logic works, I want to make sure I'm on page 1. I am. So if I run my automation now, hit play, it should skip over page 1. It should not actually click on page 1 now. It'll say that it attempted to. Obviously, it didn't need to. It's checking now. It should click on page 2, then page 3, and it should continue on. You'll notice this is going to be a little bit slower now. And the reason being is it's always checking, are we on page 1 as the current page? It's that minute, or not a minute, it's that second half delay on each page before it goes on and clicks it into the next page. So when we get to the very end, we should be good to go. It should, we haven't obviously changed any of that logic, so it should terminate after, what do we have, a 5-second delay there at the very end, waiting to see if that next page icon is there or not. We're at the last page, the 5-second count's going. I'm watching UiPath is indicating it's done to me here on the other screen. Notice it's a little bit longer again because we got those extra delays in there. The last thing of truth, this was where, recall, we always had to ensure we were on page 1 before we started. Just pick any page at random. You could leave it on the very last page if you want. I'm going to go to page 8 in my case. Now, if I run, it needs to click on page 1. I'm not going to initialize the page on 1. So that logic that we just did ensures that this thing's a bit more robust holistically. Doesn't care where I'm starting. It should now click on page 1 since page 1's not the current page. I'm going to run my automation one more time. We should actually see it click on page 1 this time. And there's the click on 1. And the reason it did that, notice I was on another page other than 1 to start. 1's not the current selected page, so it ensured that it actually did the click. So if you look at our logic, it's not on page 1, but it's counting page 1. So it's an and statement that actually goes in and executes that logic. So we'll let this thing run to the finish, and we'll get a stopping point for this particular activity. Just about done. Hopefully everybody is having success with your individual ones as well. And the last page, 13, it should time out here with the 5-second clock starting here. And it looks like UiPath is happy and completed. So that right there concludes our tutorial as it pertains to working with selectors inside of UiPath Studio.